I'm looking for the channel of our lecture, but
Okay, hello. Okay. Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Chun Choi, and I'm glad you can join us this evening. Before jumping in, I would like to remind you that we now have 2 more lectures remaining in our fall semester public lecture series. We're here every Wednesday at the same time as today at 7 p.m. in Seoul. And I encourage you to join us during our live streaming session so that you can post your comments and questions for Q&A and discussion after each talk. Now I'm delighted to introduce Professor Marilyne Andersen, joining us today from Copenhagen, I heard. But she's a full professor of sustainable construction technologies at EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland, and heads the Laboratory of Integrated Performance and Design that she launched in the fall of 2010. And she was the Dean of the School of Architecture, Civil and Environmental Engineering at EPFL from 2013 to 2018. And she's also the academic director of the Smart Living Lab in Fribourg. And prior to EPFL, she was at the Building Technology Group of the MIT School of Architecture and Planning and the head of the MIT Daylighting Lab that she founded in 2004. And her talk tonight is titled Daylightful Indoors. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andersen.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here and share a little bit of our work in this audience. And so I look forward to your questions and to interacting with all of you. So indeed, the title of this talk is Daylightful Indoors, pun intended. And so we will be talking a lot about daylight, especially daylight seen from inside out. And the reason why this is an interesting focus is to, after our 2 years of pandemic, we probably realize how strongly we want to be connected to the outdoors and to be able to have this connection with view, with being allowed to go outside, and keeping the connection to the most natural source of light, which is, of course, daylight. As you might remember or know, in the 30s, when both air conditioning and electric lighting technologies allowed us to basically control our environment to a level never achieved before, we started to also, or some started to get rid of windows altogether so as to perfectly control our environment. However, we have evolved under changing conditions, changing temperature, changing lighting conditions. And fortunately, we had an energy crisis in the 70s, and people started to realize how important it is to actually not have everything under control and keep a connection to a variable and therefore sometimes erratic outdoors, but a very important outdoors nonetheless. So the perspective I want to discuss for daylight is its experience. It's the way in which we live the variability of daylight, the dynamics, the contrast, the distribution, the composition, all these patterns that we enjoy and that are part of what makes the daylighting experience versus the electric lighting one a quite unique experience. So if we think about how daylight is typically sort of embedded in designing buildings or in evaluating buildings, we have the sun cores, obviously, which is very predictable. We have the cloud cover and weather, which is less predictable, and both together give us what we have. And then we look at it from the inside, and there we usually measure or calculate illumination. And so this is both light and solar gains. And we typically do that on an instantaneous, at an instantaneous level. So every moment, how much light, how is it distributed, and so on. Of course, it's not an instantaneous aspect of the building. It's one that varies over the seasons, varies over the day, and of course is also influenced by climate and cloud cover. So the metrics that have been developed later on are accounting for that variability and accounting for the importance of weather and annual and seasonal and daily dynamics into this evaluation. So it's not just light at noon at the two solstices, but it's more complex than that. And so there have been a lot of efforts in the last decades to get better and better about evaluating illumination for task performance, and also evaluating energy impacts of incoming light and therefore incoming energy through the solar gains. What has been maybe slightly less studied so far is the perspective of the occupant, which is actually different from the perspective of a work plane receiving light. This is one where we have to talk about visual comfort, about glare, about how you feel in the space, and about many other human factors that are typically less easy to quantify, or we can say that are either subjective or just very complex and related to both physiology and psychology. And these together should form what I would argue, what we care most about light, also because of the impact in the overall performance of a building. Whereas the impact of having a light switched on or off from an energy perspective is, sure, it's not negligible, but compared to the health or satisfaction or productivity impacts of a good environment, they are quite small. Recently in Europe, we had a new norm that came out, whose number is given here, EN 17077, which is a first in the sense that it starts to raise awareness on the combination of glare and view and light sufficiency and connection to sunlight. In the US, it's a bit the opposite. In the US, you also have a rather new norm. It's 10 years old, which also is quite interesting because it's climate-based. But for example, it tries to avoid sunlight at all costs, or to cap it with the maximum. Whereas in Europe, we try to make sure that there is still some of it because it's part of the enjoyment of daylight and of the quality of a space. So all of these are a new or somewhat new focus on occupants, which I think is very beneficial. So if we take them together, we have a combination of looking at illumination on a work plane and looking at the occupant perspective. And there, I would say there are three pillars. One is a more physiological pillar, or biological even, which is what light does to us from a true health perspective or physiological perspective. So about 20 years ago, neuroscientists discovered that we have a photoreceptor in the back of our eye that was unforeseen so far. We thought that the eye was there for vision, and that was pretty much it. But no, there is another photoreceptor distinct from the vision photoreceptors, which are actually responsible for something else, which is telling us whether it's the day or the night. So it is sensitive to light, even if you're blind, and it tells us something about, well, it tells us something about light, which then allows us to synchronize our biological clock, our circadian rhythms. And so to align those rhythms, hormonal rhythms, temperature, all of these to the actual day, which is a sequence of darkness and brightness. And the problem is that if we lose that sequence of darkness or brightness, our body is confused, and this can have detrimental health effects. The second one is comfort. So this is really more about whether we have enough light to do what we need to do, and whether it's acceptable, meaning that it's not too much to induce glare. It has been there for a while, but it's definitely part of the three human-centric aspects of light. The third one is taking the psychological perspective, so more of an emotional aspect. What do we like about daylight? What about its pattern, composition, mix of light and dark, and how does it evolve over time? All of these are aspects of light that we find delightful or that we crave, and yet that have not been much at the forefront of how we evaluate it in building design. So I'm just going to go through some of the ongoing research activities in my lab on these three pillars, starting with comfort, which is this combination between minimal and maximal requirements. So for example, if we started to wonder whether when we think about visual comfort, so our what we see and whether we are comfortable with it, whether it only had an impact on, well, what we see. So if visual conditions had an impact on visual comfort, and if the thermal conditions had an impact on thermal comfort. Of course they do, but what if there was also an impact between the visual conditions on the thermal comfort and thermal conditions on the visual comfort? So if you pay close attention to the video playing now from a beautiful building by Olafur Eliasson, and look at your thermal perception, which probably doesn't change where you are behind your screen. So it's only what you see that may or may not make a difference in how you think the temperature varies. So that was the question that we had, whether what we see could have an influence on the temperature that we perceive. Of course, it might have an influence on the temperature that there is by solar gains, but here we are just talking about perception. And so this is the kind of studies that we ran to see the influence of color on the perception of temperature and the influence of light quantity on the perception of temperature. And then we looked also at the influence of temperature on visual perception. And the results of that study were that although, of course, when it's warm, you feel warm, when it's cold, you feel cold. And when it's bright, you think it's bright. And when it's dark, you think it's dark. When it's comfortable, comfortably warm, so just right, then you do start to see a difference in thermal perception depending on what the visual conditions have been. So you feel slightly warmer in a more orange condition versus a bluer one. On the light side, you prefer a slightly brighter environment if it's cooler, and a slightly darker environment if it's warmer, possibly because of the connection with expectations about daylight. So this is not a huge effect, but it can have an influence on what to anticipate happening in places like these that you can see on the screen. On the emotional side, the idea is to look at a connection between the experience of a space and the contrast patterns. So starting with the shadows, like the combination of dark and bright, we can see that if you focus your attention on where it changes from bright to dark, you can get a sense of the visual interest of a space. At least it's one way to look at it. It's to look at contrast. And it so happens that we can associate the level of contrast, both local and global, to how you would define a space as being more exciting or more calming, and that this can also be analyzed over time. So the idea is to look at how much of these contrasty patterns move and happen over time, over the day. The day would be along the horizontal axis here in these graphs, bottom graphs, and then over the year, and then the hours of the day would be on the vertical one. And so the idea is to try to get closer to how much the atmosphere of a space, when it comes to the contrast of the daylight, changes in a given space over time. Then to take it a step further, we looked at how we can get people to react to certain conditions that from a lighting perspective would be exactly the same. And this is an experiment that we run where we had people experiencing 3 times the same amount of light in the same boring space, same 50% opening, but the openings were distributed slightly differently on the facade, and so to create the same brightness, but with a slightly different pattern. And what was very interesting was that people did react very differently with the irregular pattern compared to the other more regular ones. And so this says something about our expectations or our preferences when it comes to being in connection with these daylight patterns inside spaces. We not only asked them questions, but we also measured their heart rate variability. So we monitored heart rate, and we first had them look at the artificial lighting scene and then at these. And we could see that indeed, actually, this also changed the heartbeats and made them go slower in the irregular pattern, as if this was a calming effect or one where they would focus more. Taking this another step further, we started to look at a range of architecture works around the world, and to look at more specifically screen in facades. So the different patterns that architects decided to propose for the screens. And then we took a level of abstraction for these and put them back into a shoebox to be able to compare them and sort of get kind of rid of the architecture and only focus on the pattern itself. So here we can see what was proposed to about a little less than 100 designers to react to, and we asked them to tell us which of these patterns was maybe the most calming or exciting, so something positive about them, and then something about what was the least calming or exciting, so something more negative about them. You can make the choice for yourself based on these patterns. This is what came out of the survey, and you can see that both of the positive aspects have something organic about them, something maybe natural or slightly chaotic. The least exciting were either very regular or a bit aggressive in the angles, as you can see here on the right. So we then tested these different patterns, a selection of them, in 3 regions of Europe. The northern regions, it was Norway, middle region, Switzerland, and southern region, Greece, where the climates are very different, and we thought the expectations might be different in terms of what you like. And so we had people undergo a range of different conditions, also different uses of space in relationship to patterns. And we then analyzed the results to see whether there was any change in how these patterns were evaluated. And there was. And what is quite interesting about these findings is that, again, one of the most exciting from this time, many more people that are not necessarily designers, was again this organic sort of slightly tilted vertical stripes type. And one of the least exciting was actually also stripes, but very regularly placed. So it's interesting to see that a slight change in making this just a bit either more complex or natural was interesting. And this led us actually to start a new project on views out and on trying to determine from what we learned from these aspects, whether it is maybe what the fact that these patterns can be complex that we like, or maybe that these patterns are natural that we like, or maybe a combination of them, and how these patterns might interact with the view that is behind and its own complexity and naturalness. So this is will be an ongoing work in the next few years. The third pillar is vitality, so health aspects and physiology. So here, as I briefly mentioned, we live on the earth, and we have this cycle of night and day that our bodies have evolved with, and therefore are the photoreceptor in our eye as well. However, we don't live in bright days and dark nights anymore. We live in dim days because we are spending 90% of our time inside, which is very dim compared to the outside. It's much, much, much dimmer. It's 100 times dimmer inside than outside, typically. And then in the evening, we, on the contrary, have too much light, and we therefore disrupt regularly our natural exposure to light, and therefore our circadian rhythms, which then has impact on our sleep, our mood, our immune system, our productivity, our alertness, many things down the line, cancer risks, etc., because we don't manage to keep our body in a bright enough and dark enough sequence. So this means we should care for this, and we should pay attention in where we live indoors. If we spend so much time indoors, 90%, we better make it right. And so then there is this confrontation, let's say, between the natural solar clock, the very bad shift work that in a lesser extreme case is the social clock, so delayed to the evening, or in case of shift work, actually reversed between evening and day, but with social activities still happening during the day. And then jet lag, of course, when we travel, and we might travel again soon, hopefully, at least to some extent, we then have a readjustment to make. So all of these are directly related to our light exposure, and we can help with having the right light exposure. So it's about managing a much more complex equation actually than vision, because everything matters in this case. The intensity of the light, like it does for vision, but also very strongly its wavelength, which is the sensitivity that we have actually shifts between what we see and how we respond to light from a physiological perspective, but also how long we are exposed to light, what kind of light we have been exposed to before, and when we have been exposed to this light. These are new aspects that don't matter so much in vision, but matter a lot in these physiological effects. And they create two types of responses: acute responses. So this is typically if you go up at night and switch on your bathroom lighting, and then are exposed to light that will stop your melatonin production, which is not a good thing because you will have a hard time going back to sleep. And then the more phase shifting aspect, so circadian rhythm. So this is about this entrainment of the clock over time. And if we differentiate those two and try to represent them in a more architectural context, this is what it could look like, at least as an illustration. So in pink, it shows what you have to accumulate over time, that you make sure to accumulate enough light over your day to reach the dose kind of that you need over your time. At the same time, you don't want to have that light timed wrong. And so in yellow, you have this differentiation between when you need the light and when it might disrupt your own biological clock. So this little video is based on actually having moved the Neugebauer house from Miami to Reykjavik, and seeing that, unsurprisingly, it would not perform very well in the Icelandic winter when it comes to achieving your dose. So how to analyze this beyond looking at the outcomes from neuroscientists? We can, and we did, have people exposed to slightly more blue, which is the type of color that our physiological system, let's say the photoreceptor, is more sensitive to, versus a neutral situation. So we had a classroom that had electrochromic windows, and we could compare the two. And with the same brightness, so the same lux level, if you remember what it means, we can have just a differentiation in color and see whether this had an effect. Look also at this time the same spectrum but different intensities, and look at these and compare those two. And we realized that it did make a difference over time. So if you expose people over several days, to have a more blue environment or a dimmer versus a brighter environment on their physiology. On the other hand, it's difficult to anticipate if you don't measure it. So if you consider that what we see is also something that has a color content, we can imagine us having a day where we have different qualities of light that we accumulate. And to try to measure those and track those, we have been developing a sensor that you can wear, and that has a spectral resolution, so as to go deeper into what is it that we are really exposed to in our daily lives. Now, this seems quite far from design. It's research, so it comes before design, let's say, but I just want to get you through how this can be actually useful or used in a design context. So If you take a building like the Ryerson Student Learning Center in Toronto that was designed by SNU DAAE, so we were not involved in the design itself, but we did an analysis after the fact in collaboration with them. The idea is to wonder about what qualities of daylight will you find in these the different floors of that building. And especially if we compare those two floors, one floor that SNU DAAE called the forest. So it has several cubicles and large lobby spaces where you can meet, versus the beach, where it looks more like a kind of a auditorium that has plenty of daylight through a facade. And so if you look at these, the idea here is to take the occupant perspective. So not look at how much light is distributed over space. I mean, we do that too, but we take it from the perspective of a person standing in that space and looking around. So that person would be here standing and looking to the back here at that moment. On the left, you would have the situation with a clear sky, and on the right with an overcast sky. And then we would see how things change when the person looks around, and we could start to see how visual interest would vary based on the contrast that I mentioned before, or how health potential, this we would have to do over time, would vary as well. So by creating images or renderings from many viewpoints in a given space, and then applying them into the space itself, we can start to have an approach that supports decision-making processes in a design context based on these three pillars and these three types of metrics. So accounting for where we are and weather and so on, we embed the intelligence or these algorithms that we developed based on the 15 years of research into a format that can be then used for to appreciate the space. So for comfort, we would not surprisingly look both at illuminance level, so how much light you get on at your eye actually, and whether this is enough. And on the other hand, we would look at the glare risk, so whether this is too much light. It's a different way to measure light, but still in the end you can still say whether it's too much. Glare is a bit more complex than illumination, but you can still end up with a way to appreciate it, and ultimately to distinguish between having just the right amount or having too much. And then represented again for the two floors that I mentioned before, over space and over time, and then dig into this visualization to understand how well the space performs. From an emotional standpoint, it's a slightly different. So here we, as I said before, look at contrast and whether we are talking about a space that is maybe more diffuse, which would have a calming quality, and whether we have a space that has a lot of these moving contrasts, which we could consider more exciting, and this might even vary with weather conditions. So here, the idea is to try to differentiate where sort of the serendipity might happen, where you might want to socialize and meet, because there is a lot of interesting contrast and daylight composition happening, versus other places that are maybe bathed in light, but are more calming by being less contrasted or having it more distributed. And then again, same way to represent it in a design process to accompany the architects in their decision-making process. Third, maybe most complex, is the one related to health. So there we have to encapsulate all this knowledge about the influence of light intensity, the influence of spectrum, the influence of time, the influence of prior light history, and therefore adaptation, to ultimately find how the body would respond, and then to ultimately say whether this is good enough or not. And this is a metric that is cumulative over time, but you can still show it for any given day, also over space, by taking each view direction at a time. And of course, there are also, you can also analyze a space from a more conventional standpoint by just looking at compliance metrics such as daylight factor, but also climate-based ones and more complex ones. So all in all, what does this mean? So if we have this example of an office tower that we worked on with 3XN, where I'm at actually right now, the idea there was to discuss with them on an existing design how the building would perform from these human-centric metrics to see how daylight was distributed over space and over time, and seeing whether it did achieve the expected level of vitality, where the distribution of exciting areas versus calming areas would be, and whether the places where they imagine having work was appropriate versus places for informal meetings or encounters, the pink versus blue. And also, actually, quite interestingly, these three corner offices or the corner spaces that you can see, we realized how much they varied over time and how much of a dynamic they could bring, and therefore how interesting it might be to consider that as being a place where you can have an excitement part that is also time-based, like the morning relaxed lounge and the afternoon exciting place at different places in this building to give it a behavioral dimension as well. So if we then even go further from spatial distribution of light to how we use the space, and try to see, so for a given space, or in this case floor plan, the way in which you are going to be in that space will ultimately be driving what light you receive, and therefore if you achieve, for example, the light dose that you need. And so here we took the theoretical example of a grad student walking around and spending her day in different places, and therefore having the right amount of light to achieve her dose. Whereas the poor assistant professor would only go from the coffee machine to her office and to the staircase, and therefore would not, in the same space, but used differently, reach the healthy dose. If the building exists, we can, of course, combine this with measurement. If it doesn't, then we would do assumptions about how it's used and how people behave in such a building. We could also apply this to emotion. So where would be the kind of peaks of emotion or changes from exciting moments to more calming ones for a given path. And so I've recently been working with Velux on their Build for Life program, and the Effect architects are proposing a prototype house that we can show here, and where we analyzed the different dimensions of daylight performance inside, so both from a comfort, health, emotion, and compliance perspective. And if we now take, let's say, a focus on the health aspects, and also specifically on the morning, where standards like the WELL standard asks us to have a certain dose that would be achieved, we can start thinking about not only whether we achieve it in general in the building or in a given place based on the performance that you just saw, but also whether we achieve it depending on how we use the building, or in this case, the house. So having an idea of the house and making assumptions, one or more assumptions about how we could theoretically use it, we can design an occupancy path, and based on hypotheses about how much time we spend where over the day, we would then come up with a profile, let's say a vitality profile, that is very much occupant based, even more because it really takes into account the behavior of the occupant as well. And so this is what it would look like, going from the morning down to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, and then eating it in the dining room, maybe working a bit in the lounge space. So in each and every one of those spaces, we analyze the light that you have, and then we combine them to see the profiles that are sort of being developed on the left, where for an overcast versus a clear sky condition, we would see whether we are able to accumulate that necessary dose that you need. And basically, if we have enough time above, in this case, the 200 equivalent melanopic lux threshold that the well standard imposes. So this is an example to show how this would matter. And in the end, we go back to sleep where there is obviously no daylight. So altogether, when we think about the three pillars of sustainability, it's quite clear from this presentation that we have been focusing a lot on the social one. So by looking at emotion, health, and comfort, it's all about making sure the occupants are satisfied and happy and have a good experience indoors, despite the fact that maybe outdoors would have been even better, but we need shelter too, and we have some activities to do. On the other hand, of course, it also addresses the environmental pillar by proposing a way to use a natural resource, a renewable one for sure, at least in the next 5 billion years, that would then make the combination of the two a bearable one. So that is okay for occupants and okay for the planet. But an interesting third pillar is the economic one. We have been talking a lot about payback time of daylight and how much electricity or energy you can save by using daylight. It's a complex equation because, of course, sometimes you also have more embodied energy with glass. You also have possibly more solar gains to manage. So it's a difficult equation, still usually favorable to daylight. But from an economic standpoint and from a public health standpoint, I think the equation is much, much simpler, is that if you even increase by 1% the productivity or the satisfaction, for example, at work in buildings, this outgrows by far any energy savings you could do from an economic standpoint. So it's really the three together that work towards making the care about daylight an important one to have by truly taking the occupant perspective. And now, just before I leave you to hopefully ask some questions, I just want to bring you in on an installation that just got dismantled in Seoul, so right next to you, at the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism that was curated by Dominique Perrault, and where so the whole Biennale was inviting architects and artists from around the world to talk and propose installations about cities and the future of cities and the paradox that we have. And I hope some of you have been able to visit it. Ultimately, we sent a hybrid installation there, but our installation was actually, again, looking at the influence of the densification of cities on our exposure to light, on our need to stay connected with daylight. So through this series of filters, so we have daylight available in general on the planet, and then we have a dense urban fabric that then gets translated into architecture and zooming in on the envelope and ultimately reaches the occupant. So this series of filter was the topic of the installation we wanted to propose to raise awareness on the importance of actually keeping that connection with light, even in dense cities where we are maybe more than anywhere, more disconnected from the natural day-night cycle, and therefore more at risk of having issues related to our health because of this disconnection. So the idea is to talk about how far we are from the sky, so to speak, when we are in a dense city, and sort of make a metaphor to being in the bottom of a hole, and actually an urban canyon, but an urban canyon represented as a deep hole that then with the skyscrapers above us tell us how little of the sky we can actually reach, and represent that as an installation to have this this moment where we experience being in an urban canyon. So this is actually a 6-meter high installation where you enter, and so the bottom is an actual picture of the installation, of the one that the real installation, where you're standing and looking up and seeing the sky, the glimpses of the sky through the filtering of the urban fabric. And the idea is to focus the experience on this day-night cycle, and more specifically on the 3 phases of the day: the morning, midday, and evening, and at night. So 4 phases altogether. Where morning you need a lot of the blue, where our photoreceptor is most sensitive to make sure it knows that it's the day. At midday, you need a lot of light, basically. And in the evening, you have to limit the amount of blue light, and therefore you should move to a more orange one. And at night, you should not have no light at all. And so this is to try to make sure we are we take care of our circadian rhythms and our biological clock. We used a technology in this installation that is quite unique, which is to filter light through lenses that are shaped in such a way that they can form an image from a beam of light. So it's like in a swimming pool. If you have the waves on top of the swimming pool and you see these patterns forming at the bottom of the swimming pool that look a little bit like the patterns you see here on the picture, and you imagine that you would freeze this swimming pool and look at what waves generated this specific pattern, then the idea of my colleague was to reverse engineer this and go from the pattern that we want, in this case an image, to the waves that you would need. And so the lens that you can see here on the picture is it's a piece of acrylic for which one face was curved or wavy, so as to produce the image and otherwise the pretty crazy patterns that you see otherwise. So this is what the actual installation looks like. For those who have been at the Seoul Biennale, you may have noticed a large cylinder of 6 meter height and 4 meters diameter, but that was a white curtain basically in a structure, and inside there was a video. And so this is what we could ultimately send to Seoul because of COVID and because of the fact that we couldn't go there, which we learned 2 weeks before the opening. It was a bit sad, but nonetheless, we were able to be present at least in a hybrid form. So this is what the installation really looks like in real scale. I mean, still digital because this is an image, but this is with a fisheye lens what you see. And I would just like to end on the journey that you would experience over 7 minutes. Here it's only a few seconds, but over several minutes in that installation if you ever get the chance to actually see it. So it was an accelerated version of the experience that you also got a piece of the soundtrack from. It's a 7-minute soundtrack to get an idea of what the experience would have been. So I would just like to end with a glimpse of the team that has been doing all this research that I was able to present to you, as well as the funding buddies. So we work generally on 4 pillars on health, perception, and comfort, as I mentioned a lot, and of course, its relationship to energy as well. And the later part with a white background versus a black background was the work from spin-off that we created with 2 of my former PhD students called Oculite Dynamics. And just so you know, there are 2 of the members of my team which actually are from South Korea and have been highlighted here, Uni and Dong. So thank you very much for your attention. It would be a pleasure to answer your questions. You're muted, so you're muted.
Oh, now you can hear me, right? Thank you
Yes.
very much for your wonderful presentation. Begin with your analytical experiment, but ending with such kind of surreal. I don't know how to call it, but I'm gonna take some questions, if any, from YouTube channel, but as there is some time lag, we have a little bit of behind. So if any question from our YouTube channel, please post your question on our webboard. For the timing, I have a question for you. I read an article about a way of provocative or absurd dome, which would not have any window, to be built at University of Santa Barbara. Do you have it? Why did you respond for that?
Yes, it's very funny because yesterday I spoke at the Build for Life conference here in Copenhagen, and they had the same question. And indeed, and of course, I mean, seeing the presentation, there will be no surprise that for me this is an absolute no-go. So it's like we are back to the 30s where we thought that it was okay to live in a black box where we control everything and that this is fine. It's not fine. We need the connection to the outdoors. We need the connection to the view. We need changing light. We need a window. We do need the properties of light and the connection that it represents to the outdoors to feel good. So it is fortunately controversial, and it's sad sometimes to see that principles, in this case of a systematic plan, would drive lives of hundreds of people. That I think it's part of them will be less positive than they should. So
you're speaking so mildly. But when I first read the article, these guys are really bad. It's like, oh, I could not believe that. But
no, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that today you would still propose something like that, and that somehow there would be enough people to go with it without realizing. I mean, we have accumulated so much evidence that this is absolutely the opposite of what we should do. So what more do you need? Then the next step is to have sick people, people in hospitals, people depressed. This is what is going to happen. And then the cost will be really huge. Yeah.
Okay. Right. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm not the only one to respond that way. All right. But let me see. You know, Koreans are basically very shy. We hesitate to ask questions from kind of experts. So, all right. Well, at the beginning of your lecture, Chun Choi introduced you, but he doesn't feel good right now. I hope he. Oh, he's gone. I hope he doesn't get any positive of corona or COVID-19.
Yeah.
So again, this is such a wonderful presentation, and I was impressed with your last installation. The reverse engineering thing was really, really impressive. So,
thank you.
So I hope we have another chance to share your wonderful idea again. So today I'm gonna call it a day. Thank you again for everything.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and